David Falk was the most powerful agent in NBA history. He's most commonly known as Michael Jordan's agent, but he was much more than that. In the mid-90s, he was considered to be the second most powerful person in the NBA, only behind NBA Commissioner David Stern. But how did he become this super agent? Well, it all started 7 years before Michael Jordan was even drafted. In 1977, the Milwaukee Bucks held the first and the third overall pick in the draft. David Falk and ProServe, the agency he was working for at the time, represented Marcus Johnson, who was drafted number 3 overall by the Milwaukee Bucks. At that time, there were no such things as a rookie scale contract. It was all open negotiation. How much money a rookie was signed for was a true test and indicator of the skills of that agent, and nobody was better at it than David Falk. By some stroke of genius, David Falk was able to get the Milwaukee Bucks to sign the number 3 overall pick, Marcus Johnson, to a contract worth 30% more than the contract that they had just given to the player they drafted 2 spots earlier, Kent Benson, who's the number 1 overall pick of that same draft.
I think what happens in professional sports, particularly in sports like team sports like baseball or football or basketball, is that most players' contributions and value are measured relative to everyone else. And so there's a system they call slotting. And what that means is in the old days, prior to the wage scale, if a player were drafted number 5, the team would look to see what the player make at number 4 and expect that the player at number 5 make a little bit less and a little bit more than the player at number 6. I decided early on that I wasn't going to submit to the slotting system.
David Falk was good at his job and people started noticing. One person in particular who took notice was Coach Dean Smith of North Carolina. Coach Dean Smith already had a great relationship with Donald Dell, who was the founder of ProServe, the agency that David Falk was already working at. And on the heels of that Marcus Johnson contract, Dean Smith would make sure that all of the top prospects at North Carolina would be represented by the best agent around, which was David Falk. And how influential was Coach Dean Smith? Well, take a look at David Falk's record with top North Carolina prospects. In 1978, Phil Ford was drafted number 2 overall out of North Carolina, represented by David Falk. In 1979, Dudley Bradley was drafted number 13 overall out of North Carolina, and he was also represented by David Falk. In 1980, Michael Corrin was drafted number 6 overall out of North Carolina, and he was also represented by David Falk. In 1981, Al Wood was drafted number 4 out of Carolina, also represented by David Falk. And then in 1982, he landed a star.
For the first pick, he's 6'9", 225 pounds from North Carolina, James Worthy.
James Worthy was drafted number 1 out of North Carolina, also represented by David Falk. In 1982, David Falk helped James Worthy, a rookie at the time, sign the richest shoe endorsement deal in NBA history. Worthy signed a $1.2 million contract with New Balance, which surpassed the contracts of his all-star teammates Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. At the time, Converse and Adidas had most of the marquee NBA players, so David Falk went in a different direction and made James Worthy the face of New Balance. And then something special happened in 1984 that took David Falk's career to the next level.
And now we are ready for the 3rd pick, and the Chicago Bulls, who have been drafting very high down through the years, and they have the 3rd pick today.
The Chicago Bulls pick Michael Jordan of the University of North Carolina.
Michael Jordan was drafted number 3 overall out of North Carolina and also represented by David Falk. And building off of what he was able to do for James Worthy with New Balance, David was able to do something similar for Michael Jordan while he was also still just a rookie, when he landed a $2.5 million deal to become the new face of Nike. That deal also included royalties on every single shoe sold with Michael Jordan's likeness. David Falk was also credited with being the one to come up with the iconic Air Jordan name.
So Strasser said to me, we might consider giving him his own line of shoes and clothes. What do you want to call the line? I looked at him like he was brain dead, and I said, what do I want to call a line? I want to call it Michael Jordan. And he felt that Michael had no credibility as a 21-year-old basketball player to suggest that he was the designer of his own line. He said, look, we may be willing to do it, but you have to come up with a name, and it cannot be Michael Jordan. I literally wanted to strangle Darren. I mean, I was so frustrated. He literally came to me in probably less than a minute. I said, okay, we're going to call it Air Jordan. And he said, why? I said, Air because Nike has just developed these new running shoes that have an air technology that's supposed to cushion your feet, and it's a double entendre in the way Michael plays basketball in the air.
Nike released the first pair of Air Jordans in 1985, and in the first year alone, they sold over $125 million. Nike, Michael Jordan, and David Falk were on the map like never before. That deal changed how athletes approach endorsement deals forever. David would go on to represent over 100 other NBA players, including the likes of Patrick Ewing, Alonzo Mourning, and Allen Iverson. The three services David pitched to his clients were contract negotiations, money management, and marketing. But David's influence expanded far beyond just player contracts and endorsement deals. In 1995, the NBA experienced its first lockout when the players wanted a soft salary cap while the owners wanted a hard cap. And David Falk was actually leading a rebellion against the NBPA and pushing for decertification of the players union to make the salary cap and collective bargaining agreement violations of antitrust law. Decertification of the players union ultimately didn't go through, but the 1995 lockout did lead to the abandonment of the luxury tax, as well as the players getting 57% of NBA revenues, up from 52%. Because of his influence at the time, some people actually blame David Falk for the entire lockout. And it probably didn't help that the new deal allowed his client, Michael Jordan, to earn a record-breaking salary of over $30 million in both the 1997 and 1998 season. No player earned more than that amount for the next 20 years. The 1995 lockout didn't actually lead to any missed games, but 3 years later, as a result of the previous concessions that the owners made, it led to the 1998 lockout. During that lockout, David Falk was representing Patrick Ewing, the president of the Players Union at the time, as well as 9 other players on the 19-person negotiating committee. The 1998 season was the first time that the NBA had lost games due to a lockout. It was finally resolved on January the 6th, 1999, but it resulted in a shortened season of only 50 games. And David Falk was seen as the invisible hand behind both the 1995 and 1998 NBA lockouts. David Falk also exercised his influence in one other major way, and that was via the trade market. At the height of his powers in the 1990s, it was speculated that David Falk engineered as many as 1 out of every 5 trades made in the NBA. 2 trades that David Falk directly influenced were Stephon Marbury out of Minnesota and Patrick Ewing out of New York. In 1989, it's believed that David Falk forced the Minnesota Timberwolves to trade Stephon Marbury. He threatened that not only would Marbury leave in free agency if he wasn't traded, but that he would ensure that all of his notable free agents would also land in Chicago if Marbury wasn't traded. But just having Marbury moved wasn't enough. When Minnesota finally had a trade in place for Stephon Marbury, David Falk actually vetoed the trade because it would have resulted in his other client, Kerry Kittles, being traded back to Minnesota, and he didn't want that to happen. The Timberwolves were eventually forced to trade Stephon Marbury to New Jersey in a 3-team trade, and their general manager at the time, Kevin McHale, who was clearly frustrated, was infamously quoted as saying that if a nuclear bomb dropped on Earth, 2 things would survive: cockroaches and David Falk. A second trade which resulted from David Falk's influence was the mega trade in the year 2000 that moved the Knicks' 11-time All-Star Patrick Ewing to the Seattle Supersonics in a 4-team trade involving 12 players, 5 draft picks. David Falk apparently made threats to the Knicks that he would move Glenn Rice to the Miami Heat if they didn't consent to trade Ewing, who he wanted out of New York. David Falk was one of the most polarizing figures in NBA history. If he was on your side, you loved him. If he was on the other side, you couldn't stand him. But regardless of where you stood, one thing was undeniable: he had power, he had influence, and he knew how to use it. For all his contributions, David Falk was actually inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in the year 2016. And many agents today thank David Falk for blazing the trail and showcasing just how important it is to have the right agent on your side.